The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a very interesting report in Truthout about the reality that just a ton of Americans are heading to Mexico for medical treatment because of the high quality and relatively low cost care that they can just pay out of pocket for there instead of getting care in the United States. So this is a different sort of caravan than the one that we've been hearing about on Fox News and from Donald Trump. This is a caravan you're not going to hear that much about, but I've actually been following this for a very long time. Medical tourism is a thing. It's a sort of arbitrage. Arbitrage, in general, what arbitrage means is you take advantage of the different costs of the same thing in different places. So this could be buying a product in one place and then bringing it elsewhere and selling it. That might be one type of arbitrage that you can do. Or if you can borrow money from someone at 2% and then invest it at 2.5%, guaranteed risk-free, you can leverage that and gain 0.5% interest. That would be another form of arbitrage. And here we're talking about healthcare services, which means that even when you account for travel costs, Americans can still save a lot of money by getting health services in other countries compared to in the United States. This includes in Asia in some cases. This includes in Europe in some cases. In some cases, it's Mexico, and that's the one we're talking about today. And of course, it depends on which country, what type of healthcare services you're looking for. When it comes to Mexico, it is a lot of dentistry and quite a bit of optometry as well. There are 6,000 Americans each day that are crossing the Yuma, Arizona border crossing to go to the Mexican town of Los Algodones, which translates literally as cottons, to get care, mostly dental work. And Los Algodones has more dentists per capita than anywhere in the world. I actually took a screenshot of Google Maps above the town. This is just at one zoom level. If I had zoomed in, I might have been able to find even more dental offices, but I've circled for people who are watching right now. In like a 3-block by 2-block radius, roughly, there are at least 6 dentistry clinics and a dental school just in this small area. This is a tiny town of 5,000 people. You might also notice on this map that there are a lot of optometrists and pharmacies as well. And a lot of what's going on here is just demand. I mean, dental care is a huge problem in the United States. There are 74 million people in the United States who don't have dental insurance. Many are not by choice. So like I've mentioned before on the show, I chose to stop having dental insurance when I was 26 and was removed or lost coverage under my parents' plan. And I made that choice because I figured out, okay, based on the fact that most dental insurance costs between $300 and $500 per year and often has a yearly maximum coverage of $1,000 or $1,500 aside from your 2 regular cleanings a year. Based on me getting 2 cleanings and having like 1 cavity filled every 1.5 or 2 years or so, I figured I'll just save the money on the insurance and pay out of pocket. But that's a choice I'm making, right? It's not out of necessity. And a lot of people don't have dental insurance for other reasons. And when you look at the cost over the counter of a lot of procedures in the United States, you might have a $2,000 rather crown. You might have a $5,000 dental implant. Elderly folks sometimes will have to have a number of crowns done at once or a number of implants done at once. And it is just way cheaper and still very good care to go to Mexico to do this. If you look at some of the storefronts in the Mexican town across from Yuma, Arizona of Los Algodones, you see that they're totally set up for Americans, right? Here is a storefront from Google Maps Street View at the Molar Dental Clinic, which says that they provide the face of a great smile. They offer implants, crowns, root canals, dentures, and partials. It's all in English, right? So this is set up for Americans known to have terrible dental care. So why does this matter, right? Like, why in the context of the so-called border crisis does this matter? Americans legally going to Mexico for healthcare doesn't change that it's illegal to come to the United States illegally. But consider the scale for a second, okay? We are told by U.S. Customs and Border Protection that 20,000 to 60,000 people per month are crossing from Mexico to the United States. In this one town in Mexico, almost 5 times as many healthcare tourists are going into Mexico to get work done. There are more people leaving the American healthcare system to get care in Mexico just in this one town than the number that's coming to the U.S. from Mexico and Central America fleeing violence. And we're supposed to pretend that the crisis is people coming here rather than the abject failures of our healthcare system in one of the richest countries in the United States. And of course, the irony is, or maybe better said, the double standard is that the Trump administration is lobbying for a wall to protect Americans from mostly refugees and people looking for work, while we want to be able to go there to circumvent the terrible healthcare system of the United States whenever we want. The real crisis here, Pat, is the healthcare system. And that is what I think is completely missing from the conversation. Yes, strictly speaking, what difference does it make in terms of what our immigration policy should be that the healthcare system is so messed up that people are crossing to Mexico to get dental work? Fine, point taken. But the scope of what's going on is completely disproportionate to the crisis that we are told exists.
Yeah, building a physical wall will not only keep people from coming into the country, I guess in theory it would keep people from going out of the country too. It goes both ways. It would be kind of like the Berlin Wall in that sense. And yeah, we shouldn't be surprised by this. Immigration to Mexico is below net zero, meaning more people are going out than coming in. This so-called immigration crisis isn't a crisis at all. And this is a very interesting story that you're bringing up here.
It's important to mention that this healthcare tourism stuff is not for all conditions. So, for example, if you consider like plastic surgery, which is mostly elective procedures, but not all, there are lots of examples of people finding significantly cheaper plastic surgery in other countries. But that can be a much more complex thing. If you want to be able to get full care when it comes to plastic surgery, it's often beneficial to stay for aftercare in the case of complications where the doctor that did the procedure can see that through to the very end. There are many situations of people ending up with complications and then going to an American doctor for a cosmetic procedure they had elsewhere. And the American doctor, of course, doesn't know the details of the case and how the operation was initially done. So I'm not someone saying travel to wherever it's cheapest and just get care. What I am saying is that there are places that are very good and much more affordable for particular procedures. Mexico, and in particular this region of Mexico, is very good and affordable when it comes to dental work. And a lot of those procedures are ones that inherently come with fewer complications. Not medical advice, but just a report of what it is that is taking place. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show. We will go to the phones. We've got a great interview for you. We will take some audience questions. And the bonus show this week is a good one. It's all around a good program for you today.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
Welcome back to the show. Quick thank you to today's new member of the day, Richard Steiger. Richard, thank you. Really appreciate your support. I encourage you to join Richard at www.joinpacman.com. Support media that you believe is valuable. Also want to say thanks to Catherine Dixon, who's today's longtime sustaining member of the day. She's been with us for almost 5 years. Really, really inspiring to see people support us for so long through. I mean, the show was much smaller when Catherine started supporting us, and now we are a whole different thing. If you want to get a really great membership discount on my birthday on February 2nd, simply get on our mailing list at davidpacman.com. And then on February 2nd, you will get a very, very special email with a secret process by which you can get a David Pacman Show member at a very discounted rate. Okay, let's go to the phones at 617-830-4750. Why don't we start with our caller from the 203 area code? 203, who's there?
Hi, this is Tyler from New Haven.
Hey, go ahead.
And it's kind of a simple question, but it's kind of hard to answer, which is why I'm asking you. Maybe if you can give me a response with some kind of brevity would be helpful, I think. Basically, like in all of our lives, I'm kind of like a Marxist. I care about a lot of things. I follow politics for a long time now and like world events. And basically, there's a lot of people who just don't really understand like why they don't have any sort of structural view of like why you might be interested in why certain things happen. And I just have a lot of like apolitical people who just want to like live their lives free of thinking of anything, beyond their immediate. And so, if someone says, to you, why do you follow this stuff or whatever, is there kind of any response you can give to them?
Yeah, what I would usually say to people who say I'm just not into politics is I will say, well, what matters to you? And invariably, unless they're really apathetic about everything, in which case I would start to wonder whether they're maybe depressed and should be seeking mental health help, something probably matters to them. And whatever it is relates to politics, right? People will say, I'm just really wrapped up in what matters to me is raising my kids, for example. That's really what I care about. Just my kids, doing everything I can for my kids. That relates to politics, right? Education, healthcare, the world we live in, climate change, all of these things relate to what kind of a world are your kids going to live in. So I would probably take a sort of gentle questioning approach and say, oh, that's interesting. What does matter to you? And starting to show them that that is connected to the decisions that we make about who represents us.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Let's see who else is on the line here. Let's go to our caller from the 787 area code. Who's there from 787?
Hello, David. My name is Brian. This is the second-time caller from Puerto Rico.
Hey, Brian. What's going on?
Well, David, as you know, Elizabeth Warren launched an exploratory committee, thereby pretty much propelling her into running for president. And I find her to be a very solid, progressive candidate who supports a lot of the things that many Americans are looking for, whether if it's Medicare or Medicaid for all, $15 minimum wage, and her stance on consumer protection is, I find, very important.
Okay.
But I find that there are progressives that are not fully on board with her, which kind of bewilders me. I'm not sure as to why. And my question is, do you think that why is there some hesitancy from progressives in supporting Elizabeth Warren? And does that have an effect on Bernie's chances in running in 2020? Does that limit his chances, or does that help him?
Okay, so you're saying, is Bernie hurt by progressives hesitating about Elizabeth Warren? Is that what you're saying?
No. If Elizabeth Warren runs for president, does that help or hurt his chances in running?
Well, from a purely mathematical standpoint, the more people that run, the more people that any particular candidate needs to defeat. So in that sense, you can say the more split the field is, the more of a challenge any particular candidate is going to have. As far as why some progressives aren't supporting Elizabeth Warren, I mean, why aren't some progressives supporting any of the candidates, right? So we could say, well, with Kamala Harris, some progressives are skeptical of her record as Attorney General. With Tulsi Gabbard, some progressives are skeptical of her foreign policy positions and some other strange comments that she's made. With Elizabeth Warren, some progressives may be skeptical of her because of the fact that while she arrived at many of the right positions, as you pointed out, she sort of had to be pulled over to them from a more sort of corporate centrist angle or something like that. I mean, you'd have to ask the progressives that oppose her why they're opposed to her. But I think that anytime you have a field that already is strong with multiple candidates, by definition, some people aren't going to support any one candidate. I don't know that that in and of itself is a concern.
Okay. Well, I also think that Elizabeth Warren has always been in Bernie Sanders' shadow lately, and there's sort of like this constructive mold that many people have formed into Elizabeth Warren as being the second best candidate or the second choice. And I think that could have an effect in her as we head into 2020.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you see her as the second most progressive and Bernie runs and you're more progressive than Elizabeth Warren, you probably vote for Bernie, right?
Probably.
Yeah. So I think that that's the effect.
But I like to hear every candidate. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to hear from every candidate as well.
That's true.
All right. Thank you for the call. Very much appreciate it. Let's go to, where do we want to go next? Let's go to the 617 area code. 617, what's going on? Where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Oscar from Boston again.
Did you say this is Austin from Boston?
No, Oscar.
Oh, Oscar from, okay, good. Oscar, if we're on any kind of device that might make it harder for me to hear you, please get off of that device because we've got you maxed out and your level is very, very low.
Is that better?
That is much better, yeah.
Okay, sorry. But yeah, it's a question about media kind of in general. With the rate in which independent media is growing, coupled with like more and more people using the internet as the years progress, do you think there will be a time when cable news media completely fizzles out and becomes obsolete?
I don't think it'll fizzle out. I mean, the delivery mechanism of through your cable box may simply go away because it's irrelevant as, I mean, already the lines are increasingly blurred between what is receiving a news channel via cable versus via the internet, especially when the internet and cable signal is now all coming in on the same connection into most people's homes, right? So that I think that if your question is as to the format of the 24-hour news network, I think that's going to be around for a very long time. As far as the delivery mechanism of whether it's over the internet or via like what we would call a cable TV line, I think that that's more of a technicality, but I think the format is going to be around.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, no problem. I like it when it's a neat and tidy question and I can just give an answer, and that's what we get. Okay, let's see here. I've got a note here. Let's see. Let's go to Alex. I have a note here to be worried that Alex interrupts a lot, so that's always a risk, but I had a note that his last call was interesting. What's going on, Alex?
Hi, David.
Hi.
Hi. So my question is, so in a video you did in October, you quoted an economist who claimed that the free market has failed when it comes to energy and environment. But then in a video you did in December, you said there's no question in a free market that renewables would surpass fossil fuels in the next few years, but we don't actually have a free market because subsidies for fossil fuels. So are you arguing that subsidies determine which energy source is drawn? Because wind and solar get much more in subsidies per megawatt hour.
So let's see. I'm not understanding the question. So you've cited a couple videos, but what are you actually asking me?
I'm asking, are you arguing that subsidies determine which energy source wins? Because wind and solar get much more in subsidies when it comes down to the wire.
In what way do they get more?
They get more like per megawatt hour. So per unit of energy produced.
Okay, but why would we choose to measure it that way? Why would we measure it that way in terms of the subsidies, which ignores a lot of both the economic realities and environmental priorities? I mean, it seems arbitrary simply to say, if it's true, and I don't know if it is, that the subsidy is higher per megawatt hour. Like, what does that tell us about what's right to do?
Well, I'm saying these are like there's the production tax credit that wind and solar get, and this tax credit keeps being renewed. You know, it's since 1986 they've been arguing, oh, let's keep it up because only a few more years, wind and solar will become competitive with fossil fuels. But they keep just renewing this and giving these tax credits for producing wind and solar electricity.
Okay, and therefore what?
And well, I'm just wondering, I guess my question is, do you support a free market approach, or do you support any regulation that slows down the production of fossil fuels?
So you recognize there's a difference between regulation to slow down fossil fuels versus regulation to speed up renewables, right? Would you grant that those are two different things?
Sure.
You would. Okay. So my position is, if we are going to say that we want energy to be produced on the basis merely of a free market, then we've got to get rid of all subsidies on energy production. Right now, even though you may be right, I don't know if you're right, but you've asserted that on a per kilowatt hour basis, the subsidies are higher within some renewables programs. In total, the entire country's economy is based around both the use of and maintaining political stability for and subsidization of fossil fuels. So I would be willing to take a position that we should actually let the free market figure it out, accounting, of course, for negative externalities. I think that if we identify negative externalities, it's completely reasonable to account for that. That would be one approach. I think that another approach that I would also be open to is if we grant that the government has an interest in ensuring the persistence of our planet, it would be a completely reasonable thing for the government to do, to say we are going to encourage via economic policy the development and use of energy types that are not damaging to the planet. So I'm open to both of those ideas.
Okay. Can you name a direct subsidy that the fossil fuel industry get? Like, which one would you get rid of first?
I would get rid of all of them. And no, I don't know the names of the program. So you've cited a program from the 80s,
okay.
And I'm sure that you're not being dishonest about that. I don't know what the subsidy programs are called, but what we do know is that the reason that gas costs what it costs here is because it's heavily subsidized by the federal government.
Okay.
I just don't know the names of the programs. I don't know if that invalidates the entire
for example, okay, well, Massachusetts, where you live, they get 70% of their electricity from natural gas.
Okay.
And they import their natural gas from Trinidad and Tobago because it's so cheap. It's cheaper than coal. So how is that subsidies that are making that the case?
The particular example you gave doesn't refer to a subsidy, but that doesn't negate the fact that fossil fuel production in the U.S. is heavily subsidized. You've just cited a statistic about natural gas in Trinidad and Tobago, right?
Right. Well, these unspecified subsidies you mentioned, I mean, one of them is the home energy assistance program. So it's basically like food stamps for energy. It helps low-income people pay for their utility. That's considered a subsidy. So
yeah, but
that's
not a subsidy on the production. That's not a subsidy on the harvesting and production of fossil fuels. All right, Alex, I appreciate the call. I think we kind of know, we can tell what your position is anyway. Okay, let's go to our caller from the 425 area code. Caller from 425, go ahead. 425,
Hello,
are you
David?
there? Yes, that's you.
Yeah, David, it's Richard.
Hey, Richard, what's going on? Richard, you're breaking up. You're cutting out, Richard, and I don't know if we're on speaker, but can we do anything to improve your connection and audio?
I'm not on speaker.
Okay, there we go.
I'll try
that
to
sounds
speak
good.
as clearly as possible.
Good.
Hey, I'm one of the federal workers affected by the shutdown and
Yeah.
not receiving a paycheck. And my question is to avoid, to solve this problem, couldn't the House put together a funding bill that included basically an oversight committee that would be bipartisan, that would choose how those funds would ultimately be spent? Essentially, oversight that the language could include funding for some kind of physical barrier, but that oversight committee would be a check against the president, and, it would be a way to, basically save face for both sides.
You could do it. The thing is, I don't know that either side is really into that. I agree with you that it would be a way for both sides to plausibly save face, but Donald Trump has been pretty clear that he just wants funding for the wall. Democrats have been pretty clear that they don't. So I totally agree with you that there are a whole bunch of ways that this could go forward. I mean, you could even have a situation where there's an agreement on everything but the wall, and a particular committee is appointed to discuss the wall. But obviously, that's still going to leave you with Republicans unsure that it's going to happen and Democrats unsure that it's not. So you're completely right. I mean, it's a ridiculous circumstance we're in where they have not been able to move forward on this. And by they, I don't mean that it's equally Democrats and Trump to blame. I mean, this is the Trump shutdown, but there are all sorts of possibilities, and it's going nowhere so far. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and could I just add real quick something that hasn't gotten out in the news at all, and that's that we are being faced very shortly with a second paycheck being missed. And as a result of that, what's going to happen is our vision and dental plans are going to send us premium bills to keep those benefits that we will have to pay in full.
Yep.
And it hasn't really been talked about in the news at all, that's specific. We will keep our health insurance, but vision and dental we could potentially lose if we don't pay those high premiums out of our own pocket.
And correct me if I'm wrong.
So
isn't it about if you're paid bi-weekly, aren't you about to miss your third paycheck?
Well, technically, yes, but it's going to come up to basically 30 days with no pay.
Right.
And I guess once premiums are not paid to those programs within 30 days, they start mailing out bills, and that's the full premium, including the share the government would normally pay.
Right. Yeah, and obviously, I mean, I'm guessing when government reopens, you would be paid back for that, but in the interim, you have to front all that money.
Yeah, and if we don't pay it, we lose that benefit for the whole year, and the soonest we can get it back would be next year, essentially.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that's. I hope it gets resolved soon for your sake and everybody else's. Okay, that's it for today. I'm out of time. Sorry to everybody I didn't get to. We'll take calls again. Appreciate everybody who called in.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today's classic interview is one I did with Chuck Collins back in 2015, and it's so relevant to much of the discussion we're having right now about income inequality and what policies we should be looking for in order to improve society overall. Because Chuck Collins is a rich dude who explained why inequality is bad in no uncertain terms whatsoever. And when we now have a rich dude in the White House who doesn't really seem to think that inequality is a problem and who is not pushing any kind of policy to deal with the fact that we have this bigger than ever inequality and lopsided ownership of wealth in the United States. Compare and contrast, and of course there's really no comparison because Chuck Collins actually knows what he's talking about and is capable of abstract thinking, something that the current president hasn't shown himself to be able to do. Think about what Chuck Collins is saying and advocating for in my interview with him compared to the doctrine of Trump and his acolytes and cronies. This is my interview with Chuck from December of 2015. I'm joined today by Chuck Collins, who's an author and also a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also co-founder of Wealth for Common Good. Chuck, we've been talking about income and wealth inequality in the United States. We know some of the incredible statistics, like, for example, that the richest 20 Americans own more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country. I want to talk to you about the economic and social impact of that. But before, give us a sort of summary of how we even got to such an incredible gap when it comes to wealth.
Well, I've been tracking this for almost 30 years. So we basically have seen a gradual growing concentration of wealth at the top. I think there's no single cause. There's a number of reasons why that's happening. But I would argue that probably the single biggest driver is that various rules of the economy, tax policy, trade policy, et cetera, have benefited asset owners at the expense of wage earners. And so I think we're seeing assets expanding, wages being stagnant for almost 30 years. But it was really only 10 years ago that the median income was 85. The median wealth was like $85,000. It's gone down, and this concentration at the top just continues to defy gravity, really.
And when we think about, one element we've talked about is productivity for the average worker continues to increase. In other words, the average worker is producing, whether it be goods or services, more than ever before. But as you mentioned, their wage is not going up. And that, talk to us a little bit about that, right? I mean, the additional productivity that workers are creating is sort of being moved up in a redistribution of income, as some like to say, to those at the top of the income brackets and big corporations.
Yeah, so I would say a huge driver is, productivity's gone up, wages have stayed low. Most of that productivity gain then, the wealth and income gains from that have gone to not just really the top 1%, but what we're seeing really in the last 8 or 9 years is it's going to the top 1/10 of 1%, who've captured most of the income and wealth gains at the top. So that's clearly a driver. And, as the French economist Thomas Piketty has pointed out, if that's the machinery, if left without intervening in any way, where we're heading is we're seeing going to a kind of a concentrated wealth, a sort of a plutocracy, where wealth continues to concentrate, wealth and power continue to concentrate at the top. So we have to do something to intervene in that inequality cycle.
So people can have different opinions as to whether this is moral or ethical, what we see happening. But let's not have that conversation. Let's have the conversation as to what is the economic impact of such wealth inequality. And then whether it's moral or not becomes sort of irrelevant if we can make some general assessments as to whether this is a good or bad thing for the economy at large. So how can we think about that?
Well, one thing to think is that this concentration of wealth actually kind of creates a huge amount of distortions and volatility in the economy. So you have real wages staying flat or falling for most of the population. That means that the aggregate demand, the consumer buying demand of people at the bottom and the middle is really not as engaged. And then at the very top, you have this unreal concentration of assets, which leads to sort of some unreal risk-taking. Meaning people at the very top, I'm talking about, the top 1% of households, are starting to move and a portion of their wealth into more financially speculative investments, investments that get higher returns than the real economy, which isn't, returning a lot in terms of interest or earnings. So you have this twin dynamic. You have stagnant wages on the bottom, and then you have concentrated wealth at the top, looking more and more, venturing into the sort of speculative arena of the marketplace. And all of that leads to certain volatility, huge volatility. So just take the energy market today or over the last couple of months, or real estate in major urban areas. Those are all local and national and global economies that are being distorted by these great inequities of wealth. And as we also know that it sort of undermines the traditional measures of growth. I mean, the International Monetary Fund is now showing at the global level how these inequalities actually undermine traditional measures of economic growth. So too much inequality is bad for the economy in a number of ways.
And what about the social impact? The economic analysis you've done is very clear. We've talked about it before. We've spoken to other economists about it. What about the sort of intangible social impact of such wealth inequality?
Well, I think what we know is that as societies become more unequal, there is a breakdown in solidarity where people no longer feel that they're in the same boat. And it actually increases sort of a sense of fear and polarization. I would argue, in some ways, our 2016 presidential election dynamics, where you have a Trump and a Sanders candidate, they're both emerging out of the same phenomena, which is this is what happens when middle classes collapse, when people feel like the economy is rigged against them. Whatever political analysis they take with that may send them in different directions, but the underlying problem is this polarization. So I think it leads to kind of a whole bunch of negative indicators. It's bad for health. It's bad for public health, even for very wealthy people. It's bad for social cohesion. It undermines sort of neighborhoods and communities when there are these volatile and destructive inequities. So I think it sort of pulls at our culture. It moves us in the wrong direction in terms of us as a society.
There's certain issues we talk about where there are very clear sort of action items or asks that the average individual can do in terms of engaging lawmakers or engaging with the political system or society, etc. With this one, it's been more difficult for us on the program to figure out what individuals can do. I mean, certainly it would be great to elect more politicians who would put in policies that would have a sort of equalizing effect to reduce this drastic income gap that we have. But what can the average person really do?
Well, I think continuing to talk to their friends and neighbors about why these inequalities matter, believe it or not, is very important, because I think as a society, we've gone from 10 years ago when we really didn't talk about it to a broader recognition and connect the dots. These inequalities really do affect the quality of life for all of us. Then I think there's a sort of three ways to think about the solutions. There's the things that raise the floor, like raising the minimum wage, creating a better sort of social safety net. That's what many, Canada and other European countries, the reason they have less inequality is they have a higher floor. There's also things that we can do to level the playing field. We shouldn't have one tax code for the wealthy and one for everyone else, one for global corporations and one for everyone else. We should have a level playing field in terms of those rules.
And isn't there a challenge there, though, in that those who have sort of set up the system the way it's set up have no real interest in allowing it to change, right? Those who benefit from that system would prevent it from changing to the extent that they're able.
Yeah, we're sort of in a little bit of a locked-in position, which is the power of concentrated wealth has captured certainly at the national level, captured our electoral system. So it's very hard to talk about rule changes that would meaningfully reduce this inequality. But I think if you look at the undercurrent, think about the number of students that are holding debt. There's a political constituency. Look at polls that show that the public supports taxing incomes on millionaires. 75% of the public now supports those kinds of policies. So there's a realignment happening at the base, which I think will lead to a political realignment eventually, not in the short term, because you have a Congress that's pretty much beholden to the donor class. That's why I'm saying I think we also have to sort of put on the table policies that may not actually pass today, but we sort of build an understanding of why they're important, like taxing progressive inheritance taxes, taxing higher incomes at a certain level. There's a piece in the New York Times today that looks at the aggressive tax avoidance of people really in the top 1%. So we need to restore the progressivity of the tax system. That may not be wildly popular or politically feasible in the short term, but we got to keep beating that drum. Eventually there will be a realignment, either that or we can become a kind of society we really don't want to be.
I'll tell everybody once again, we've been speaking with Chuck Collins. He's an author. He's a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and the co-founder of Wealth for Common Good. Chuck, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thank you, David. Good chatting with you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's get into audience questions for the week. They've been good. 2019, very, very solid year for audience questions. Okay, first one. Hey, David, with all of the new Democratic presidential candidates basically being in favor of single-payer healthcare. Is single-payer healthcare a new litmus test for Democrats in 2020? Yes, in a sense, but sort of in name only. Okay, I've mentioned before that there's a bunch of different kind of elements to this litmus test of single-payer healthcare. Question one is, what do we mean by single-payer? Okay, because there's a lot of confusion about whether we talk about a Medicare for all type of system where the government becomes the single payer to all sorts of doctors and hospitals and medical professionals, versus nationalizing the healthcare system, which means that the government becomes the employer and administrator of the hospitals and the doctors and so on and so forth. So number one is that when we say single payer healthcare or universal healthcare or Medicare for all, those can have different meanings, but they've kind of become just catch-alls for one of these systems, which might differ. The system in Canada is not the system in France, is not the system in the UK. Okay, so that's number one, which is there is this overarching idea of different ways for the government to get involved and to make sure everyone has access, which vary all the way from nationalizing healthcare to the government taking over the insurance portion of it. So then we get to, do all Democrats basically have to say that they are for that at this point? I think that right now, if there was a Democratic candidate who appeared that said, I am not for single payer or Medicare for all, healthcare for all, universal, whatever, right? Assign whatever name you want to it, it would be a major problem for them. I think that they would not be seen as serious contenders at this point. But the reality is that just having a Democratic president is not going to be the determining factor as to whether we get something like Medicare for all or universal health care or whatever. So what you're going to see is the more corporate Democrats basically playing coy, as I've talked about before, by saying things like, I think that that is an absolutely great end goal that we should be working towards. And then when you ask them, well, what will you actually do during your term on this issue? They may really just have a focus on tweaking Obamacare or adding a public option to Obamacare, putting the mandate back in, which is sort of how the entire thing is funded, or that type of thing. So I do think that the litmus test is there in spirit, and that is or maybe not in spirit. Maybe it's there in terms of the letter of what they're saying, but there are going to be many ways for Democratic candidates who don't really have an interest in pushing for that as president to say, I'm for it in the sense that I think it's the right end goal. And they're probably, Pat, going to be able to get away with that because in the end, it's not going to be up to them whether it passes or not. Without a Democratic House and Senate, the president can basically say they want whatever it is that they want. It's not going to happen if it's something as big as nationalizing the entire healthcare system or saying that we're going to move to a Medicare for all expansion.
Well, let me point out that this has been Bernie Sanders' effect on the party, that pretty much every candidate going into 2020 has to at least in name support Medicare for all. But as you point out, some are going to fight harder than others for it. Like if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren is president, I think they will fight tooth and nail to get Medicare for all. But if one of the establishment types like Kamala Harris or Joe Biden gets in, even if they campaigned on it, they're going to be willing to back off pretty easily and then maybe settle for tweaking Obamacare. So I think that is important, and it's important that we get a real progressive in there who is not only going to talk the talk, but also going to walk the walk.
I wonder if we should be skeptical of Democrats who don't have a long track record of saying they're for Medicare for all or something like it, even if they insist that they've come around on it. In other words, as you point out, Bernie Sanders has been talking about this for a very long time. Let's say Biden runs and he says he is for expanding Medicare to cover everyone. Should we be skeptical of that because it hasn't been his position for a long time, or should we just trust that he came around on it and that's what he now wants?
You definitely give priority to the people who have been in support of Medicare for all throughout, just like with any other issue, like those who were in support of gay marriage back in the year 2000 versus Hillary Clinton, who only came around to it in 2013. You have to give priority to those who have been fighting for a long time. And, even if these other people say that they're going to be in support of it, that's good, and we have to give them credit for that, but not nearly as much as those who have been fighting for it throughout.
I tend to agree with you. I'm basically on board, and we will see if we have any prominent candidate who says, I don't see Medicare for all or universal health care or single payer of some kind as what we should be doing. Next question today is from RJ. RJ says, hey, David, how can we combat statements like black people are brainwashed by the Democrats from the right? Okay, so there's a lot tied up in this question. If you have not heard that statement before, that's great. I wish I had also never heard it. But the idea of the brainwashing of voting groups implies that you have a group of people, an identity group, that votes for one party or the other, despite the fact that they would actually be better off by supporting the other party based on the policy, right? So like with black voters, what the Republicans have been claiming is black voters have been brainwashed into voting for Democrats, even though they would be better off by supporting Republicans, because you have to demonstrate that. Otherwise, black people are just voting for Democrats because the policies of Democrats could be or are better for black people, which I believe is actually the case. So to start examining this, the first question you have to ask is, okay, on which issue is the Republican policy better overall for black Americans than the Democratic policy? And I can't think of any such policy. You will hear people from the right who say that affirmative action is actually bad for minorities because it is an example of the bigotry of low expectations. The soft bigotry of low expectations is the way they like to describe it. I believe that there is no factual case to be made that that has been the impact of affirmative action in places where it exists. And remember that in most places, affirmative action does not actually exist in the way that is described by the right. So unless you can actually link some specific policies of the right with lack of support for Republicans by black people, the even mere claim on its face that black people have been, quote, brainwashed by Democrats falls pretty flat. Now, in fact, when you think about it, there's a much stronger case to be made that poor and lower middle class right wingers are the ones who have been brainwashed by the Republican Party. And I think back to the Tea Party in 2010, you had people who statistically will never be rich, statistically will never earn $250,000 a year, which I think was the tax bracket sort of in question at the time that the Tea Party really wanted to lower the marginal tax rate on, saying we support the Tea Party despite the fact that the policies would be great for rich people and not good for lower and lower middle class and even middle class Americans. So if you want to see political brainwashing, it's all the people on the right that insist on voting Republicans against their own best interests. Now, let me go to a counterexample to the black people are brainwashed by Democrats meme. When California had a referendum vote called Proposition 8 around gay marriage, which was widely supported by Democrats, you didn't see black people come out in droves to support gay marriage in California. So it's almost like black people can understand that on most issues, Democrats actually have the right slate of policies to improve their circumstances, but they're not just going to go out and vote for gay marriage merely because Democrats want it. The black population at the time, and still to some degree, has more skepticism of gay marriage and homophobia within its borders. And that was very much reflected in Proposition 8. Mostly they vote with Democrats, but they broke with many Democrats on that particular issue. I do want to point out also, there's a bit of an implicit racism in saying that because Republicans are very united as a voting bloc nationally, they are brainwashed, but that same standard is not applied to other groups. I'll give you an example. Jews in the United States are very liberal. Jews vote, depending on the election, 75 to 80% with Democrats, with the more liberal candidate, with the more progressive candidate, whatever. If anything, you hear the opposite, which is that Jews are brainwashed by the pro-Israeli antics of the right. Well, if they are, it seems to have failed or confused them because they're almost exclusively voting for Democrats, but you don't really hear that word applied. So my instinct, Pat, is that there is some implicit racism in saying that the united voting bloc, not completely, but significantly of black people, is a brainwashing, but it's not applied to other groups.
And might I add, if you're a Republican strategist and you're trying to pick off some African-American voters and persuade them to vote with your side, it's a really bad idea to be condescending and start saying that they're brainwashed. Like, that's not going to work out for you.
No, I completely agree with you. And then there's also the issue of sort of conservatism pushing individualism in many ways. And Black Americans, like many other groups, have a strong group identity, which goes beyond policy. And it would be another reason to favor generally collectivist policies. And in the United States, to the extent that there is a difference between Democrats and Republicans on that, Democrats are the ones advocating for the more collectivist policies than Republicans. And that would be a very specific political reason why you would see Black Americans support Democrats more than Republicans. So there's really simply no evidence for this brainwashing that the right claims exists. Okay, last question today, and it's a doozy. Hey, David, I think identity politics is great. Can you change my mind? It depends on what you mean by identity politics, okay? I've said before, recognizing the importance of identity is great. We should all do it, okay? Our identity brings a particular experience and point of view. We exist in the world as people of certain gender. We exist in the world as people of certain age, people of certain ethnic backgrounds and religions. To pretend that identity provides no window into policy and ideas and is relevant to politics, that would be crazy. Okay, so of course identity matters, and we need to account for identity, listen to people on the basis of the perspective that their identity gives them. Identity as a trump card to silence, to exclude or marginalize other views, that's where it becomes a problem. And earlier in the week, we talked about identity politics as a point of view for arguing bias with David Webb. David Webb, this Black Tea Party guy who during his show was told that his view is influenced by his white privilege by a legal analyst who didn't know that she was talking to a black guy. And that just benefits the right? I mean, the playing of that type of identity politics by the left, and it's not a huge issue, but it exists. And so I mentioned that it exists and it's not a good thing. It helps the right galvanize and coalesce voters around even worse identity ideas. Much of Trump's success with white identity politics, the alt-right, the identitarians, that entire thing, the threat of the status of middle-class whites, for example, all of that was seen by them. I'm not saying I agree. It was seen by them as a necessary response to left-wing identity politics. It's much exaggerated, obviously, but it doesn't help the left. So if you love identity politics because you think identity is important and we should evaluate ideas by understanding that someone's identity can give us insight into what makes sense, I'm right there with you. But if you support the sort of identity politics games that I've identified as completely destructive to the left, show me how they benefit us. Show me how they work. I've not seen any evidence of that. We have a great bonus show for you today. Become a member, become a patron, and you'll get instant access. Otherwise, you'll have to wait till Monday for the next show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.